QSO Today, episode 295, Bry Carling, AF4K. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. If you're stuck at home like me, then now is the time to buy and build a kit. Thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. This week's episode was recorded just as we in Israel were going into quarantine and social distancing during the COVID-19 virus outbreak. So our references in this episode are a week or two old. Currently in Israel, everything is now closed except for critical food and pharmacy suppliers. Everyone is working from home, if possible, with only the really important reasons to venture out. It's a great time to get on the air as a ham radio operator, as we are the original social distancing. I encourage all of you also to light up the local repeater and reach out to your local hams who may need help with their shopping or trips to the pharmacy. We are a great community. Let's not leave our fellow hams alone, disconnected. My QSO today is with Bry Carling, AF4K, old radio boat anchor collector, co-founder of the Novice Rig Roundup, and keeper of thousands of old-time crystals for sale for your next rig restoration, or if you decide to build Bob Heil's pine board project. Bry is an eclectic kind of guy, and we get into most of it in this week's episode. AF4K, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Bry?
For Z1UG, this is AF4K. Good day, Eric.
Bry, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, it all started with my Uncle Jack's tape recorder. They came to dinner at our house. I have no idea who else was with him, but as everybody left the room to go to dinner, I saw that Jack hid the tape recorder behind a chair in the living room, set it to record, let it run. After dinner, we all went into the living room to chat. There was Mom, Dad, Grandma, me, Ivan, and our guests. After we chatted, Uncle Jack went behind the chair, brought out the tape recorder, rewind, stop, play. Grandma refuses to believe that it's her voice, unyieldingly. Of course, this was all great entertainment, and I was never the same. Always curious.
This was in the 50s when Uncle Jack brought out the tape recorder, so a tape recorder was a relatively new phenomenon.
Yeah, my brother and I had never seen one before, believe it or not.
And probably your grandmother hadn't seen one either.
Certainly my whole family had never seen one.
So what captured your imagination about the tape recorder?
Wow, it's a box you can speak into, and it speaks back to you with a copy of your voice.
So what happened after that?
I don't really remember what was said or done, but I do remember that my grandmother refused to believe that it was her voice, and we all had a good laugh at her, because the next thing we knew, I was recording her listening to the wrestling on Saturday mornings on TV and yelling out things like, "Pull it off and hit him with the soggy end."
And how old do you think you were at this point?
Probably 5 or 6 years old, and living in the suburbs of London.
So the tape recorder perhaps gave you an interest in technology and maybe electronics. How did that proceed from there?
Man, I became very curious. Every time I saw anything to do with electronics or radio, my ears would prick up. Some years later, we moved from London to Cambridge, a distance of about 50 miles north. And I became friends with some bad boys in the village who introduced me to Fred Taylor, G3 RFP, the only ham in Cottenham, Cambridgeshire. And he worked in technical publications at Marshall's Airfield in Cambridge with my dad at the time. So I went to, I was told by my devious friend if I would go to Fred's house on Saturday mornings, I could go there and have radio lessons, when in actual fact what happened was I went there and sat and listened, and of course my friend soon left, and it was mostly me listening to Fred on Saturday morning 160 meter AM roundtable net, in which I got introduced over the radio to various characters in the area.
And did you have a chance to meet those characters at some point?
I did. I was taken to the Cambridge and District Amateur Radio Club on Victoria Road. At that time, I was 16 years old. I'd been attending the Cambridge and District Amateur Radio Club on Victoria Road. There was quite a bit of pride among the scientific community of Cambridge in those days. That medieval city, built almost 1,000 years ago, has a familiar feeling to me as I walk down the streets, all relaxed and happy. But I also remember sad and lonely times there as a younger man, how it's changed now. The row house places on City Road are all gone. I go back there, and it's still the same place, but it's changed dramatically.
Now, did you get your first license as a teenager in those days? It's my understanding that the amateur radio license in England, you had to be, 16 years of age minimum to be able to get the license?
That's absolutely correct. At the time, I was just coming up on 16 years of age, and as soon as I turned 16, I got myself organized to take the train down to London and take the two different tests. Isn't it odd how US and UK mirror each other's style of government, with two tests required, one for Morse code, one for radio theory and regulations, but ours was quite different, Eric. Hang on a second here. I've got the question list from that test that I took in London, 1966, 1967, administered by the City and Guilds. 10 questions, answer 8 questions as follows. And the questions are things like, what are the conditions of the sound license as regard to the coal that's used? They're none of these, not one of these is a question that you could answer with multiple choice. Like, I'd never seen multiple choice till I went to an American high school in Lakenheath on the American base there, not far from me.
Yeah, here in Israel, they call multiple choice American style.
Yeah.
So multiple choice was not widely held as a way to do things outside of America.
Yeah.
So just out of curiosity, did they also make you in those days, 1966, they also make you draw schematics of oscillators or amplifiers?
You've heard of this test before, haven't you?
I think so.
Yeah. Draw a circuit diagram of a frequency multiplier stage and explain its action. I like that. This is like being in school and taking a test, Describe the construction of a power transformer capable of providing one output of 360 volts at 100 milliamps and one output of 6.3 volts at 2 amps from a mains source of 240 volts AC at 50 cycles per second. What is the turns ratio for each secondary? What is meant by magnetizing current? What would be the current in the primary if the two secondaries are each passing their full rated output? Disregard the losses. That's an important statement.
You could be an electronic engineer by the time you passed the license and moved on.
It's absolutely true. We had no introductory license. At the time I got my ticket, there were less than 10,000 amateurs in all of Great Britain. And I think, by the time I, moved over here, there were only 20,000.
You were about 16 years of age in 1966. What was the first call sign that you received?
Well, I actually had a shortwave listener call, A4941, that was issued very officially looking by the RSGB. And I used that on my shortwave listener report cards that I would send out to radio stations that I heard. And that was a very common thing done in the 60s.
Was it a legal requirement to own a shortwave radio that you actually have a registered call sign?
I don't know. You may be right about that. At some point, I think that may have been true. I don't know.
What was the call sign that you got when you got your first amateur radio license?
G3XLQ.
And did you have a first station at that point? Did you have a station of your own?
Yes, I did, and I'm going to send you pictures of it. Unfortunately, some of them are missing, but I've got them on my hard disk drive. I had an R1155 receiver that I bought and paid for. by doing whatever jobs I did, delivering newspapers or whatever. That was the common thing that shortwave listener boys did in the 60s, I think. Somehow I read about that in a magazine. Go ahead, Eric.
That was a military surplus radio, right?
It was. It was a receiver that had been used in the Lancaster bomber, which, mixed feelings about hate and death and war, but at the same time, glad that we were on the winning side, you know.
There you go. What was the transmitter?
I homebrewed a transmitter, copying a magazine article from Practical Wireless in, I think, the middle or late part of 1964. It was a tube that had two caps on the top of it, and I don't remember what it was, except that the tank coil was wound on a wooden cotton reel, and it worked very well. The reason I knew it worked very well is that it interfered with all the TVs in the neighborhood.
And do you remember your first contact?
Oddly, I do not.
Oh, that's okay.
The reason I say that is that takes us into another area, which is the CCF, which is, and I don't want to change the subject from where we were unless you're ready to.
I'm interested in where you're going. So what it was, the CCF?
Well, the CCF was an organization very similar to the ROTC in this country. And what they did was they had all kinds of things that went on there. I've got so many stories, Eric, I don't know where to start. You know, the CCF was just part of it. And about 1964, we moved to a small, peaceful village, Cottenham, about 8 miles northeast of Cambridge. At my Elmer's house, Fred was using all kinds of strange ham lingo, QRM, QSB, 73s, 5 and 9, etc. Fred's receiver was an HR-10. Those old UK AM operators were very polite. They all acted like nobility on the air. It was grand. There was no such thing in those days as 2-meter repeaters, and SSB was just coming into its own on the HF band. All of it was done with 10 watts of AM on 160 meters, which I know kind of connects with what you were saying earlier. You know, I got to know the voices and the names and the call signs of the hams in my area. But one of them, my friend Alan, G3WUW, also went to the same high school as me. And here's where a phase shift occurred in our thinking. He was the one of all people at school who taught me the Morse code with his one transistor phase shift oscillator on the steps of our school at the county high school for boys, as it was then, during lunch breaks. He lived in the village of Over, which was 2 villages over from where I lived, over in Cottenham. I made trips to his house in Over on my bike, and also to Willingham to the SWL shack of my friend David Jipp. Now, Alan and I also built some equipment for the 6 megahertz CCF net in those days, combined cadet force, in conjunction with some pals over at the Lees LYS school in Cambridge, using things like 6AG7s and a 5B254M. I'm sure most of your listeners are not familiar with that, but it's a Lochtel 807. Our call sign was Whiskey Lima, or was that the call-up signal? I don't know. Used like a CQ to contact other stations. I can remember Alan yelling Whiskey Lima signals into a carbon microphone on the old 19 set at the county high school after school one day. My first experience with piracy, with HT of about 800 volts on the anode of the poor old 807 glowing red hot. And the power was from a dynamotor. The homebrew 807 rig came later. I did most of the construction on the darn thing, and the best I remember, it did actually work. And so that was kind of the end of that story.
So the combined cadet force actually had a 6 megahertz channel that they used to scramble the troops?
Yeah, they had weekly nets that they would call up, and you could very often hear not the generator, but the dynamotor whirring in the background.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get outside and be active with ICOM's new IC705 HF to UHF portable transceiver and its optional multifunction backpack. This is ICOM's perfect solution for SOTA and parks on the air. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion with its base station features and functionality at the tips of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilogram or 2.2 pounds. This beautiful new rig has RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz, and includes a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with a live band scope and waterfall display. The ICOM IC705 will be the replacement and amazing 21st century baseband rig for microwave DXers, rovers, and contesters, and the operating choice for those under the new S-Hail geosynchronous satellite footprint. Unbelievable. The radio is 5 watts with its internal battery and 10 watts with an external 13.8-volt power supply. This full-featured radio operates on single sideband CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Included in this package is a micro USB connector, Bluetooth to support linking to your smartphone or Bluetooth headset, built-in Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone, which is standard equipment. The perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional backpack, the LC192, with a special compartment for your IC705, with plenty of room for antennas, cables, and other gear to get you on the air from the mountaintop or the local park. There is a link to this amazing new rig on the QSO Today podcast website for this episode, and when you order your new ICOM IC705 from your favorite ham radio dealer, be sure to tell them that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for their continued support of the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO Today. You and Alan didn't belong to the CCF, but you joined into their weekly conversation.
I haven't quite figured it out yet. I had a friend at the Lee School, and I think that he went over there and watched what they were doing and came back to our school, set up a 19 set that he got from Dickie Deuce's scrapyard in Cambridge on Coldham's Lane, I believe, and got the whole thing working. Being the thick glass rim glasses guy that Alan is, G3WUW went on to be an amazing salesman around the world, selling radio equipment to airports and whoever needed it.
Here you are in high school. You have an interest and a friend, Alan, and you're interested in amateur radio and electronics. Is this interest causing you to decide that maybe this is what you want to do for your education and career? Did you go on and get a degree in engineering? Did you go get a degree in psychology because engineering wasn't that interesting? How did things work out for you?
Well, engineering was interesting for me. I think because of my dad, I was always looking for an angle on things. When I was a little kid, my dad told me more than once, looking me in the eyes, the world is your oyster. And that should tell you something about the kind of person my dad was. Unfortunately, he died at the age of 49 from lung cancer, leaving me 21 years old with a mom and a brother.
Your father always saw the opportunity in every situation.
Yes, and tried to open my eyes to it as well.
I'm sorry for your losses as a young man. What happened after that? How did you go on?
Well, my dad died of cancer following a car accident close to our house. I'll just say it wasn't easy, and you can broadcast that if you want. It was something that really formed my life, probably as much as my early electronic experiences did. But my dad kind of lives on with me in a certain sense.
So how did your life proceed from that point? You're now living in the United States. How did that come about?
Well, it all started with a girl.
It usually does.
And that's what they always say.
Right.
It's such a long story, but go back to Georgia in 1967 and me going to high school and subsequently meeting girls and losing my virginity.
Somehow you ended up in America in high school. Were you transferred somehow to America from England?
Well, the odd thing about my father is my father didn't have a college degree, okay? My father had my father had a night school training, but not even a night school degree. He had postgraduate training. It's what you did after World War II. And it served our country and our people very, very well. But my dad actually ended up teaching night school a few years later after his trip to the USA and his experiences living in Georgia and Tennessee and other places, and coming back and living to tell about it.
Right, because this was during the 60s in these places, right? If you were in Tennessee and Georgia mid-60s, then you were in the middle of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I moved there to Atlanta in the middle of what they call white flight. I was too dumb and too young to know anything about what all of this meant. You know, when you're 16, you have no idea what people are telling you. It's all crazy. This guy belongs to the Ku Klux Klan. You know, but he'll talk with you all day.
So you came to the States for a couple of years in high school, and then you went back to England.
Yeah, I came to the States for high school, 3.5 years, and then moved back to England because the draft was on for the Vietnam War over here. And even though I pay no taxes and could not vote, I was still eligible for the draft. Imagine that.
So you were eligible for the United States draft for Vietnam because you were in America, not because you were an American citizen.
Right, because I was in America, I was eligible for the draft. Now, trying to figure that out.
According to your website, you spent 30 years in medical electronics. How did you find your way into medical electronics?
Medical electronics I got into as a result of combing the newspapers for an ad for a job. And I think that was the last time I combed the newspaper want ads for a job. Would have been around 1979, okay. 1980, actually, December of 1980. Do I hear any advance on December? No, December of 1980. I called and applied for this job, and I was living in Nashville at the time, and we can get into that in another section. But my new employer was up in Ohio, so I was, demonstrating the same daring that my dad had done with his career, and going out and going after jobs, which I feel is, it's all a bit of an act that you put on for people. When you go interview for a job, you write a CV, you go out and you meet with them, you describe what you would like to do, you answer their questions, and there you are, So I ended up in Nashville, and 1972 that was. It's a bizarre story, but I moved to Nashville in 1972 to marry a girl. Pregnant pause. And then I had nowhere to stay, and I was sleeping on the couch in the living room of her apartment with her mother. And it sounds like a convoluted story, but I'll get to the point. During that time, I ended up going to church with them, which I hadn't done in many years, several years. But we went to this church, and they had an altar call, and I went forward, and I cried, and I got baptized, and somebody handed me a Bible. No, I'm just kidding. At that point, I looked up an old friend of mine who had spoken to me in Nashville, and he just died the early part of last month, Paul Pitts. And I never heard from Paul Pitts after he left, but tried many times to get in touch with him because he had affected my life so much. I used to get high with him over at David Lipscomb College and listen to music together and go to concerts that people will organize on a conservative, traditional Christian college campus with all of their big amplifiers and guitars and noise. And guess what? Before they could start and play a note, they were kicked out by security. And so that was part of my introduction to the Church of Christ, which sort of figures into this story, and how I come to never really join, but hang out with them. that was another little sojourn in my life there that helped me find my way into being married and having 2 kids. From 1972, I was repairing guitar amplifiers in Nashville for 3 years, and then I taught high school for 3 years. 1978, I think, was when I finished teaching high school. I taught high school electronics for 3 years. As if the story isn't deep enough already, how did I get that job without a degree? Interesting parallel there to my dad. Once I took this job, all bets were off. I had been, running service calls around Nashville, doing various things, and 1978, I had only been at that point a casual musician. However, I did play the guitar to my wife as she walked down the aisle.
What's your current rig, Bry?
It's an FTDX 3000 from Yaesu.
I saw from your website that you've got a lot of links to old gear and parts, crystals, things like this. Do you also have homebrew rigs, or do you restore old rigs?
I have had homebrew rigs. The last one I made was a 6BM8 driving a 2E26 and getting about 12 watts out, which was not bad. And I made a lot of contacts with it, but it was sort of an unfinished project. It was somebody else's chassis that I built on. But I built a lot of accessories and add-ons to different rigs, as well as experimenting with receivers and doing goodness knows what else. My life took a big turn about 15 or 20 years ago, maybe more, maybe more like 18 years ago, when I started making crystals and selling them to radio amateurs. And, there was a slow but steady realization of what I had tapped into here. It wasn't like one day I took $100,000 and said, I'm going to put that into a crystal making business. I'm going to put that into a crystal marketing business. As I went along, I was reminded of my dad's old saying, the world is your oyster. Keep looking in more of them until you find some pearls. And that's kind of what I did. In the beginning, I just ordered 4 or 5 frequencies of HC49 crystals and stashed them away somewhere where I could find them. And I started letting the world know that I could supply them with FT243 crystals. And, all of a sudden I got quite a bit of response. And I told my wife, well, this can't last long. Maybe 6 months and we'll be out of this and go on to finding something else to do. But what it did was it provided me with a nice spare time income that didn't get me the house on the hill or make me super rich. But what it did was it gave me the security that I needed to go forward. And there is another player in this equation here that gave me courage to go forward, who deserves a mention also. And that is Dave Collings from Erith in Kent. So, Dave, if you're listening, happy hello to you. Thank you for your example of decades of producing crystals at Quartz Lab and imparting to me how it should be done.
At a time when, I think 20 years ago, International Crystal was still going in Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah.
But I think that their business, or at least maybe they felt their business was beginning to wane. Why did you have a different look on, especially things like HC49U crystals, when it appeared that that era was gone?
I guess because I knew the demand that was out there. I had been on various emailing lists and discussion lists where guys would talk about, if I could only get an FT243 crystal for $38.85, man, I would jump on that. And I would see that as a pearl in the oyster.
So the demand from rebuilders or refurbishers or home brewers, this was where that came from?
Well, more the boat anchor crew more than anything else. I think they've made up at least 50% of our orders, if you can believe it, for crystals to run AM with on 80 meters, 160. I got in a lot of 160 meter AM crystals early on because I knew I might not always be able to get them. And so we have a very broad selection of 160 meter top band AM crystals, as well as CW ones.
Are you making them now? Are you manufacturing crystals yourself?
So yeah, there were those small crystals with wire leads that were taller, which presumably means they have a larger hunk of quartz in them. Well, we know this is not always the case because we have opened up some of the older HC13 and HC6U crystals, and occasionally they'll just have a little bar in there. But that's the newer ones after 1960 whatever, you know.
It's my understanding that Bob Heil, K9EID, he started a couple of years ago his pine board project. Has the pine board project been a source of customers for crystals for you?
Oh, absolutely, yes, it has. We got a surge, I would say, for several months after that article came out. We got a bunch of orders, yeah. The funny thing is, though, what you lose on the swings, you pick up on the roundabouts. And I don't know whether your listeners know that expression, but what it means is when you pick up sales in one area, maybe they drop off in another, and so it kind of evens out.
Do you see a future for projects like this? Do you think that the hams of today might actually become the builders of tomorrow?
I kind of do and I don't. I'll tell you why. I think there's, a small percentage of hams have the kind of eccentric experiences that I've had. I think the biggest challenge facing amateur radio today is staying relevant. Finding new areas to excite young people who've had these eccentric experiences and channel their energy into it.
But don't you think that ham radio is a big tent, and that maybe what we're not doing well, perhaps, is saying that, just about every technology that people are using has a place somehow in the big tent of amateur radio?
Yes, I think that particular view is a very good one because it unites us. We live in an age that has mistakenly gone down a road of being divided, and trying to blame leaders of political parties for that division is a dangerous road to take, in my opinion. But my dad told me when you're in America, don't get involved with politics. So I have studiously stayed out of it.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
Do you think that the way that Americans are looking at politics also affects the way that they look at amateur radio in terms of the areas of interest that they might pursue at the risk of other areas they're not pursuing?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I think the scientific explanation for that is that large amounts of money have been sunk into infrastructure that has not served us well because it was designed to be a tax break for somebody rich. I think I see that in a lot of ways, that there are functional and non-functional things you can do with technology. For example, you can build it up, you can break it down, you can make it do whatever you want it to. It's like we keep getting our minds blown by these new technologies and new products, but we may have reached a tipping point, Eric. I don't know. What do you think's coming next?
I'm actually enjoying this whole idea of the right of repair, that there's a political movement in America to require manufacturers to allow, once again, schematics and repair parts for expensive devices that people are buying that are designed to be thrown away and not repaired. So I think that's kind of an interesting direction and maybe an opportunity for hams with technical knowledge.
Ooh, that's a really good direction for the future. Yeah, because what are you going to do with all of it when you've got too much of it piled up in one place? You can either give it away or you can burn it. You can sell it if you can, but maybe you don't have buyers anymore. Then what are you going to do with all the stuff in your garage and your house and everywhere else? We don't have a warehouse. I'll tell you that right now. We have our garage. That's it. Maybe that's telling too much to put on the air. I don't know.
Well, we have our attics and basements as well. I think, we're kind of the same generation. You're a little bit older than I am. but I tend to fish stuff out of the garbage when I'm walking the dogs, and it goes up into the attic for a future project.
Yeah, exactly.
My wife's unable to get into the attic. She has a handicap, so she has no idea what's up there. She's only concerned that at some point the whole ceiling will crash in on us because she hears the door open and stuff go up, but she has no idea what's up there.
We actually ended up putting floorboards in our attic so that we could put heavier boxes up there and not have them crash through into the garage.
I have floorboards up there as well. Well, I'm thinking, look, one of the ideas or the things that perhaps delights me about the right to repair is that all of us, I think, have iPads that are in perfectly working condition, except the operating systems of them have now advanced to the point that they no longer work, in which case you have to buy a new one. Or we've got drawers of perfectly good cell phones, smartphones now that seem to be fine.
I'm looking at two of them in my trash bag.
Right, except that we can't upgrade the operating system anymore. So I'm hoping that this right to repair will also include the right to jailbreak these devices, maybe with some simpler operating systems to allow those devices to be used for something rather than go into the landfill.
Absolutely, yes. That's brilliant. I like it.
I think that's what hams are good at. When you give them a question, they'll figure out how to do it.
No, that's exactly right. And it's something that we all did, I think, as younger boys. When we were growing up, you could turn us loose in the neighborhood and we wouldn't break things. We would have like pellet guns or slingshots or whatever, but nobody in my neighborhood had a knife that was wielded in violence publicly ever. It's hard for people to realize that you could grow up in a world like that where that just never ever happens. And I mean, it would happen, but once in a blue moon, somebody shoots somebody with an air gun and they're not really injured. You know what I'm saying? And it's like now, in order to relax, you've just got to let your mind go. Don't think too much.
It's my understanding that you operate AM. Am I right on that assumption? Because I was looking in some of my research, it looked like that you like operating AM. Do you still operate AM?
I do still operate AM, but most of the time it's calling CQ or calling other people and hearing that sound that my son used to make when he was a little boy. And he would listen to me on the ham radio, and he would go, "I can't hear you. I can't hear you."
I'm just wondering whether or not you still operate AM, whether you join, for example, the guys on 80 meters at night who are using, say, broadcast transmitters or repurposed broadcast transmitters for operating AM, whether that's what you do.
No, it's really not. We're so far south down here in Florida, and the noise levels on 80 meters at night are so bad that you really are not going to hear anybody that well that's on AM. I know that may sound strange to you, but we've just come through a winter here where propagation was pretty sorry. So I might get on AM and call CQ once in a while, but I know where it's going. There's usually going to be no answer, and I found the same on 40 meters also. But there is hope at the end of this story. Because every once in a while, even the three-legged squirrel gets a nut,
What's your favorite operating mode now, then?
I would say by far that CW is my favorite operating mode now.
And which band? 20 meters?
Really, I'm everywhere. 160, 80, 60, all the way through 10. But I'll tell you, I have not gone above 17 meters in a long time.
It's dead to the world out there.
It is just dead to the world, yeah.
What do you think when people say that, because I've heard this before, people say that the bands are completely dead, they're not hearing anything, and yet every contest weekend the bands are crazy. Is it really dead, or are people just listening?
I guess people with the high-powered equipment are listening. I think other times the bands are not so dead, but they only open for a short while around sunup and sundown, like half hour before sunset, half hour after sunset, and then they're gone. And that's not always the most convenient time for us to get on the air.
That would be like gray line conditions, right?
Actually, that's right, gray line conditions, because for some reason that's just how it works.
What's your connection to the Novice Rig Roundup?
I basically thought of it, basically it was something that I thought of and persuaded Gary, WD4NKA, to help me with. And then we enlisted several different people, and we found a way to get a club together and have a club call sign and have our meetings over the phone, which, as you all know, is a great idea now. But that's basically how it started. And then we got other guys interested who had been part of the original Novice Roundup in the 1970s. I think that's when they all were done, 70s and 80s. And, when the Novice license dropped out, then Novice Rig Roundup dropped out. And then they came up with Rookie Roundup, which is like, if you're a baseball fan, sure. But, that was basically it,
Isn't the Novice Rig Roundup an annual event now, or is that some other event?
Oh, yeah.
Is it now under the umbrella of the ARRL?
No, ARRL doesn't want to sponsor it. We wrote to them and asked them if they would, and they said no. And we said, well, you know what? We'll just do it on our own. It's not that big of a thing to coordinate and advertise and all the rest of it. And there's a bunch of us manufacturers who contribute prizes to people not based on merit, but based on participation.
So essentially, anyone that wants to be a part of the Novice Rig Roundup gets out their novice rig, but they also register somehow with the Novice Rig Roundup so that you actually know who's going to participate in that evening, and then do they send your logs, or it's not necessary?
They actually have an online logger that you can use, and at least a third of the people participating use that online logger, and it gives you a running total of the QSOs made, the average number of QSOs, and all the usual stats and data. But the interesting thing about it is a few years ago, you could have not persuaded many old-timers to use that kind of online logging. And now, look at them. They're coming back every year and using it.
Well, do you think that's because we're now online?
Yeah.
As opposed to connecting long enough to make your modem do its thing, exchange information? We're just all now just connected all the time. It makes it seem like it's easy to do.
We take it all for granted. It's just hilarious to me how it's all taken for granted. I mean, it could be here today and gone tomorrow.
It's $1 trillion worth of infrastructure that we rely on to be able to log for the Novice Rig Roundup, right?
Exactly.
What's the novice rig that you use for the Novice Rig Roundup?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I've been using a Drake 2NT and a Drake 2C matching receiver. However, I recently sold them to a fellow in Arizona. I shipped them to him. He's super happy with them, and he's been using them all this week on the Novice Rig Roundup, which I didn't realize. Today is the last day, and it ends in just under 8 hours.
But the Novice Rig Roundup is, because you started it, is something that you try to regularly participate in?
Yeah, I have not missed a year since it started. It's been going for 3 or 4 years now and gathering momentum the whole time. So, we don't even do that much to publicize it, really, other than just letting people know by word of mouth.
So you're not operating this year?
Well, I'm operating, but it's a 10-day event, so I'm not operating the whole time.
You've sold the Drake 2 series. What are you using in its place?
In its place, I have a DX60B, and I have Echophone, an Echophone EC1 receiver, which, by the way, is in dreadful shape, but it receives. It's been repainted with a horrible silver gray over the top of the wrinkle black finish, but you can still read all the nomenclature on the switches and knobs.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. How important did you think the novice license was then for beginning hams? Should we bring it back?
I thought it was like, for me as a teenager coming here, it was like a new magic world, man, where suddenly all things were possible. I don't know how to explain that to everybody else, but it's just how it was, coming here and wait a minute, they've got these catalogs that are 100 pages thick that you can get for free that have pictures of walkie-talkies with their specifications in it. We never had that in England. We never had that in Britain. We never, you know what I'm saying? It's like new magic world.
That was then. Obviously, we're inundated with technology, and so therefore we think about, or maybe we don't think about what's really happening in order for us to be able to communicate from one side of the world to the other. I'm actually talking to you on Skype and calling your phone, but the fact is it's easy for me to do it even though I'm 8,000 miles away.
Mm-hmm.
But I think nowadays we don't think about it. Is there a way, do you think, to somehow reignite the magic of this technology in people who are trying to get into amateur radio?
Man, that's a really good question right there. I think we're going to have to see how the dust settles after this latest virus, but I'll tell you what, it's not going to be a game changer in terms of how human beings operate. What it is going to change, and quite dramatically, is probably the technology, I would guess. And anything that provides an avenue into it for young people taking an interest is just a marvelous thing, in my opinion. It's like the biggest challenge facing amateur radio today is staying relevant. What most excites people about amateur radio now is it is an escape from the humdrum and the busyness of the day.
I think that was also true 40 years ago. Do you see that amateur radio operators have become siloed in terms of they're in corners that don't necessarily cross into other corners of the hobby? Or do you think that there's now enough combination of technology that it causes us to kind of stray into other areas of the hobby, even by accident, to cause a new interest?
Yeah, that's a very good question for younger people. I don't think my interests are going to change that much, but you never know. You just don't know what the future may hold. And, there may be challenges that we like to take on and other things that we can do to help technology from being siloed. You know what I'm saying? It's like if you're siloed, you can specialize in something that somebody else may not.
What's your favorite piece of test equipment on your workbench?
I would say probably the digital multimeter. It's the one I go to the most for testing shorts and open circuits.
What's the project on the bench right now?
Probably making a bunch of crystals for somebody. It's a mess. I'll be honest with you. It's a mess down there.
Are you putting those crystals on frequency? Do you do that, or do you already have them on specific frequencies?
I'll be honest with you. This is why I wanted to avoid this.
You wanted to avoid the conversation?
Yeah, I've got racks and racks of them that are just taking up my whole garage here. And we ship out quite a few. Will that continue? I don't know. Will it ramp up? I don't know. Will it ramp down? I don't know. I'm looking at all the predictors. I'm watching the news. I'm watching the economy very closely.
It seems to me that when the economy is down, people stay home. They do more hobbies, perhaps, rather than going out. It's still cheaper. Do you think that you could create a project or drive a project like the Pine Board transmitter project, something like that could actually drive demand for crystals?
Well, I think it actually could, and I'll tell you why. I thought of many different things I could do like that would create demand for crystals. And Bob had told me at one time he was going to do a 160-meter version of his rig, and he never did it, as far as I know. So maybe I'll do that.
There wouldn't be a lot of modification except to change out the LC, right? Or the L. Keep the C the same, right?
You probably have to change a couple of other things, but it wouldn't be too hard to do.
Even make it a multi-band rig.
Oh, yeah, you could. There's no reason why you couldn't make it a multi-band rig, except that the crystals for 160 don't readily multiply up to other bands.
Right.
Or do they? 1945 kilohertz does. It will double to 3890. So there you have one.
So you can use one crystal for two bands.
Yeah. if you're a CW man, you can use one crystal for multiple bands down at the bottom end of the bands. Isn't that interesting?
Right. All you have to do then is to create, if you can still buy them, these wafer selector switches to do your band selection.
Oh, yes, you can still buy them.
For each band. So then you can make a multi-band transmitter out of the Pine Board project.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that we find is an interesting thing is that men will run to the shelter of a comfortable, convenient way of connecting with their friends, you know. They'll run to that, whether it's baseball or cricket or football or soccer. They want to go to it. And the biggest shock right now is that all pro sports are canceled. You know, it's what?
Is ham radio that shelter for you?
That's a very poignant question. I think it is somewhat, yes. I think sometimes it disappoints me, but I think at other times it encourages me or provides me a safe haven to go to, yeah, maybe.
Are you still an active member of a ham radio club?
I'm not at this point, although I do occasionally go to the to the local Lake Monroe Amateur Radio Club meetings once a month. But I've only been to a handful of them since I've lived here. Too busy making crystals, man.
You have a history with the guitar. How important was that history, and how is it relevant now?
Extremely important, and it's relevant now because my older brother was my musician hero from a young age, and leaving England at the age of 16 when he was, 24 or something. No, not 24, 23 and a half. So he was around 23 or 24, and we left England and came over here. Our parents used to kind of bang our heads together and literally tell us to pat each other on the back and go, ba, crazy things like that, because they were trying to develop in us a bonding, a friendship, a way to overcome the natural standoffishness between people, shall I say.
It's my understanding that you and your brother had a band for a while?
It's rumored that we had a band for a while, but there's only been 2 or 3 occasions when we played together. Actually, one of them was at a family reunion where we just sat on the sofas and strummed the guitars and sang. And then there was another one that I won't go into, but it was another time, another place. And my brother and I are still in touch on the phone several times a week from over in England to here in Florida. And he has meant an awful lot to me. He is a professing atheist. And, I don't know what I am, but we have had an ongoing conversation since we were quite young. He is now 75 and lives with his wife, Barbara, in rural Cambridgeshire. He's still playing out at gigs several nights a week. But of late, not quite so much. Of late, things have slowed down in Cambridgeshire.
Are you playing out gigs?
Yeah, I was actually booked to play one yesterday morning as a duo that got canceled at our city hall.
The listeners who are listening now, but who may be listening in 10 years, we're right now in the middle of the coronavirus outbreak. Over here in Israel, everything has been closed. Everything has been closed. Schools are closed, any venues are closed, restaurants are closed, and I think that's happening over there where you are as well, right?
Not so much yet. Give it another few days and they'll find a way to close everything.
The first thing that was closed were musical events and theaters, everything like that over here. I'm a musician as well who's now been closed. It's an interesting thing that's happening right now, and hopefully if people are listening to this in 10 years, they'll actually have some sense of what's happening. What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
Well, when I first got married, my wife didn't know that I had ever been a radio amateur. Pregnant pause. As she began to find out, I kind of gently introduced her to the subject, and then one day a shiny new FT101E showed up on our door. And at that point, she started taking more and more interest, listening, trying to do the right thing to be a good wife, as it were. And she ended up getting her call sign. We went to community lessons at a high school, if you can believe it, that there were over 100 CB operators attending the class to get their amateur license. And I'm sure that's very much unlike today. And the teacher was an old ARRL officer with a great sense of humor named Max. And Max was from up north and for some reason living in Nashville on business. And, he would sort of smile and look around the room and just let everybody talk until they were done talking. It's like he was the most tolerant teacher you could ever meet. And we went to his house a couple of times. I forget why. But Marie and I went over to Max's house. And, of course, he had his good buddy, W4WHN for November. Max was WHM for Mary. And his good friend, I'm trying to think of his name now, was WHN, Skip W4WHN. And we just knew that they were friends, and that was it. And Max had us over to his house for some reason. I do not remember why.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, I'd have to say, in view of the situation as it is today, is that amateur radio could provide a germ-free way of people conducting business from one place to another without making human contact. Imagine that.
Well, since you can't conduct business over amateur radio, I guess it could provide the social opportunities that are now lacking as a result of not being able to be in close contact.
Yeah, it does also enable you to, from your home, order things and have them delivered. However, they're going to be laid on your front doorstep in a plastic bag, and who's going to do that, and blah, blah, blah. But we're all hoping that this thing will pass pretty soon.
Do you think that Amazon deliveries will be provided that are germ-free? It's an interesting idea. People are going crazy buying stuff on Amazon.
Isn't it funny how Amazon was experimenting with drones to deliver packages a few months ago, and I'm sure they're still continuing it, and fighting the legislation to get it done so that they don't have to employ delivery people. Now, that's really some question right there.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Jump in with both feet. Don't just dip your toe in the water of amateur radio. Some of it may seem futile at times or may seem distracting, but before you know it, you'll be getting to know hundreds of radio hams in your area and participating in nets. That's something that's really dropped off quite a bit. And now maybe seeing a big revival if people are, self-isolating in their homes.
What kind of antenna do you have on your QTH?
I've got a very small lot here, so the antennas are, I've got a vertical 4BTV that I put up quite a long time ago. We've been in this house almost 20 years, man, and you wouldn't believe the stuff you can accumulate in 20 years in one house. Be that as it may, the antennas are 100-foot end fed. It's 100-foot end fed. This is a rather unusual arrangement. I've got an MFJ 998 on the back wall of the house, and it's mounted with 4 concrete bolts to a brick wall, so it's not going anywhere. And then I have 2 or 3 other antennas on the house, which are not so high, but they're on a mast. It's like an 8-element for 2 meters and a 12-element for 432. And I've got a separate rotator, obviously, for those. And on top of them, there is a Diamond X200 vertical. And I have a 3-position switch for the VHF radios to be able to select between those. So that's my antenna farm. Not very simple. Not very elaborate, let's put it that way.
So the MFJ 998 is an antenna tuner. Are you feeding that 100-foot end fed with that antenna tuner?
Yes.
You wrote someplace that you're not crazy about open wire feeders to your antennas. Why is that?
Because I have had nothing but trouble with them eventually. One of them melted certain company's balun, which I won't mention the name, but it's one of those things that if you put 100 watts into a 100-watt balun, you're not always going to get 100 watts out, depending on the match.
Right, that's true. I think there's some people that think that you can put a balun in the middle of a dipole and then match it with an antenna tuner at the bottom.
Exactly.
It's not good for the balun. It's not good for the antenna tuner, probably. It's
not good for either. Yeah, the outer shield of the coax becomes the counterpoise. And the way that works is you put an RF choke on the end of it near the shack, near the equipment in the shack, so that it doesn't radiate into the equipment.
So you're feeding the MFJ 998 with a coaxial cable, an RF choke on the equipment end, and then you're feeding that as a end-fed wire from the output of that 998?
Yes, sir, and it's an MFJ 998RT remote tuner. The plain 998 that goes on the shelf in your shack will not do this job.
You say you're on a small lot. That wire does not have to be straight. That wire could actually be kind of zigzagging around the yard.
Oh, yeah, it zigzags all over the place. It goes across the wall about 10 feet and then straight up to the top of the tower, which is 30 feet, and then across the roof of the two-story house and down again to an end pole that is attached to the garage.
And how does that antenna work?
Well, I say it works extremely well if you're patient with the 3 tuners that are attached to it, and that drives me nuts, but I won't go into that.
You have an antenna tuner on the radio.
Yeah.
It's part of the radio. And you've got an antenna tuner after the radio before it goes out of the shack?
Yeah, there's one in the amplifier that's pretty hard to defeat.
The radio and the amplifier actually feel pretty comfortable except for the...
Yeah.
And I would imagine that most of your losses are actually happening in the MFJ 998RT, right?
I'm guessing that's correct. I don't really know, but I'm guessing that's correct. And honestly, in amateur radio, losses are not that significant.
Where I'm going with this explanation is for hams that are on limited city lots, you can actually do quite a lot with a end-fed wire that's zigzagging all over the yard.
You really can, and I have done this numerous times on all bands from 160 through 10 meters. Using this set, I think I've even used it on 6 meters, but there's no point doing that because my beam up at the top of the 30-foot tower that covers, and it's very clever how it works. It's a beam that's made in Canada by a company called TGH, which I have no idea what that stands for. But the guy who sold it to me over the phone was very helpful and very impressive. And the antenna is actually extremely small. It's smaller than the spider beams that are so popular and probably not quite as efficient. But you know what? It gets the job done. I can put out a signal on all those bands, and the wind is not going to tear it down. So I'm not complaining.
Are you a DXer?
I have been a DXer off and on, and I do enjoy collecting DX countries, but I don't have a huge number that I'm proud of. I'm old enough now that it's all kept in its place in my mind. It's all stuff that has to be kept in its place. Let's put it that way.
Bry, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast.
It has, Eric. I've really enjoyed getting to know you better and hearing a little about where you live.
Okay, Bry, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. God bless, and I'll talk with you later, my friend.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Bry. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in AF4K in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support for these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at the checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor, monthly or annually, by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 300. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn."
Special thanks to Ben Bresky, who now edits the audio for this QSO Today podcast from the audio pieces that I give him.
Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.